webinars. My name is Dan Wastell. I'm a Principal Education Advisor here at Cambridge Education, and I'll be moderating this session today. The fifth of our legacy webinars. This one is focusing on the role of non-state actors improving the quality and reach in education. I'll just do a little introduction to set the scene and put it in a bit of context of the other webinars of the series before introducing and then handing over to our panelists of speakers today. There'll be opportunities to ask questions towards the end, but feel free to put the questions in the chat as we go, as you think of them, and we'll try and pick those up at the end and make sure we have time to address those. So welcome everyone. Helen, next slide, please. During this series of webinars, we've had a few themes that have run throughout. And so for those who haven't been in all of them, which I'm sure maybe some of you, we're just going to touch on a couple of the themes that have flown throughout and I think are relevant to today's webinar. In the first webinar that we did, we looked at system coherence for learning, the idea being that to generate sustainable, scalable education outcomes, learning or other outcomes, we really need to focus more on building system coherence, not just focusing on one or two subsystems. And that involves looking at both vertical interconnectedness throughout the state delivery system from national level to the classroom, but also coherence and connectedness between horizontal subsystems. So for in learning, looking at how materials connect with curriculum, connect with inspection, connect with assessment, and so on. And that's really important. And I think that's going to be that idea of coherence is very relevant to what we're going to look at today. Next slide, please, Helen. In a later webinar, my colleague Khadija Fancy then expanded on this idea to focus on the idea that in many of these kind of tricky challenges in education, we need to have an even broader and deeper view of what coherence is across a wider government ecosystem that doesn't just look at that delivery system, but goes beyond the education ministry into other connected ministries, to extend down into communities and families, and to look into the attitudes, behaviors, and powers that connect all of those pieces together. And again, that's very, very relevant when we're talking about the role of non-state actors and integrating them. And then finally, next slide, please, Helen. And then so today we're taking that a little step further. We're looking beyond the education delivery system. We're even looking beyond the kind of government ecosystem into a much more broad definition of what the education ecosystem is, could be, and should be. Thinking of not just about what's the role of the government, but what are the roles of the various non-state actors that connect to and work with in various ways that government, that public system. So anything from private businesses, NGOs and non-profits, private sector finance, parents, communities, research and advocacy groups, and many, many others. How can they all play a role? What should their role be? What could their role be? How can we work to connect them and make them work more collaboratively and enhance that coherence between the state and the non-state system? So that's setting the scene and in the context of our wider webinar series. Yes, in this webinar, we're going to be kind of adding an additional layer to that onion and focusing on the non-state actors. And as this slide shows, they're far from a homogeneous group, even though we lump them together in our labeling sometimes, and they can play very different roles. Some of them temporarily fill gaps that the state's unable to. Some provide specialist expertise that the state isn't able to, or perhaps shouldn't have to. Some are playing roles that shouldn't be part of the state but need to connect into it. Some address segments that the state has a role with but not full responsibility for, and many other roles that they play. At Cambridge Education, we've always believed that good state systems require good non-state actors working in partnership with them. But I think as the landscape has changed in the education sector, and particularly in the external funding of international education, and the power dynamics that come with that have shifted, it's a good time to reflect on what we've learned from working with some of our examples of non-state actors. And so we're delighted to have three panelists here who bring very different experiences of non-state working with non-state actors. Firstly, we have Rosie Lugg. Rosie is a technical director at Cambridge Education and has a vast and impressive background in both education and skills development. In fact, much of her work prior to Cambridge Education was with non-state actors in that space, and even embedded with ministries, so she's seen it from both sides. With Cambridge, she's played many roles, but most notably for this webinar has been our team leader in several projects bridging state and non-state actors in the education, skills and training world. Aggie Nakira hails from Uganda, but is calling in from Sierra Leone right now, where she is the deputy team leader, and she's been the deputy team leader on several of our successful basic and secondary education projects that have used non-state actors in various ways, from strengthening girls' education, building disability inclusion into systems, and enhancing foundational learning. Today, she'll be focusing on the latter through the work that she was involved with communities in Uganda during what I think was the world's longest shutdown during COVID. And finally, Daniel Gisaka is our team leader on the very successful Girls Education South Sudan project. He's been playing various leadership roles in this project in this country for a long time now, through various stages of conflict, peace, humanitarian response, development progress, and various things in between. And one of the reasons for the success of that project in those various circumstances has been in part to a highly successful model for using and integrating non-state actors into the education system that he'll be looking at today. I know he's, just a note on Daniel, I know he's trying to call in from somewhere in South Sudan, and I'm not sure how good his line is, so our colleague Khadija Fancy is on call to step in if needed. We were due to have initial reflections from Lucy Lake, director of Yidan Prize. Unfortunately, she had to pull out yesterday due to family emergency, and said we're delighted to have our own Emma Sarton to reflect a little bit on what she's heard at the end and draw from her work with non-state actors during the Girls Education Challenge Fund. So hopefully that sets us up for today. Without further ado, I'd like to invite Rosie to kick us off. So Rosie, if you'd like to introduce yourself a little bit and then tell us a little bit about your experience with non-state actors in your projects. Why did we work with them? What role were they playing? What value were they providing? And what did you think they achieved that state actors couldn't have done alone?
Well, thanks very much for your introduction, Dan. I don't think I'm going to dare to add to it. And if we could move to the slide while I just explain a bit about what we've been working on. So as Dan noted, that we, as Cambridge Education, we managed skills development funds in both Mozambique and the Eastern Caribbean, 4 countries in the Eastern Caribbean. And in those projects, we worked with non-state actors in the vocational education and skills development ecosystem. And explicit in the theory of change for those programs was that including non-state actors into the broader skills system would lead to better employment rates, more productive employment, and involving non-state actors could contribute to more inclusive employment outcomes and labour markets. And so in both of these programs, non-state actors were involved in various different roles. They were involved in delivering skills interventions, as some were training providers, often specialist providers in a particular economic sector or in a particular region of a country or in a particular phase of youth development. Sometimes they were specialist providers in particular areas like socio-emotional development, or in representing youth with disabilities. All the grants were awarded to non-state actors, and always in partnership with employers. And so what I've tried to show in this slide is that the one of the purposes of the programme was to strengthen connections between the non-state actors involved in the skills ecosystem and the state system, and in that way improve both the reach and the quality of the skills ecosystem more broadly. So it was a cooperation between state and non-state, and the points of connection to the state were the national regulatory bodies for TVET, or the sometimes called qualifications authorities in each country. And in Mozambique and the 4 nations of the Caribbean in which we worked, the issue of sustainable financing for TVET had emerged in government policy through some discussion around training funds. And so that was a kind of longer term policy consideration that FCDO, who was funding this programme, was looking towards. So in both Mozambique and the Eastern Caribbean, FCDO established a skills fund, and the fund itself sat outside the state system as well, had it freedom to develop its own investment strategy and to award grants to implement that strategy and deliver on the strategic goals of the fund. And in both contexts, the goals were, as I said, leading to increased incomes, better employment for disadvantaged youth, more inclusive economic growth. And the fund strategies could be very focused and were highly targeted. And I think this is partly where the success of the funds came from, was that they were targeting specific groups of students, so disadvantaged youth in all contexts, but youth with disabilities in the Eastern Caribbean and women in Mozambique, and specific areas of skill. And this again was where the each fund carried out independent and in-depth labour market surveys in each nation. And the investment strategy was agreed in terms of where there was very strong potential for job growth, not just economic growth, but job growth. Mozambique, this was found to be mainly agriculture and construction. In the Eastern Caribbean, it included agriculture and construction, but also included ICT, green technologies, the care sector, hospitality. Grants were only awarded for skills in those sectors, vocational skills in those sectors, but all included, or often included, I shouldn't say all, or often included foundational learning and additional specific services that have been evidenced to improve access, retention and achievement for disadvantaged youth. So we had a scholarship scheme, there were mobilisation processes that could be funded, costs for work experience, placements and transport costs, all of which are key barriers for disadvantaged youth. And we also targeted specific gaps in learning pathways. And this is where I think, again, the funds were able to operate appropriately in dysfunctional labour markets, of really targeting and carrying out highly local research, labour market research, and brokering at a local level, and connecting providers to employers and intermediaries and additional services in that locality to deliver an effective programme. Just one example of that kind of specific gap was we had connected state TVET providers around an industrial park in Maputo in Mozambique to employers in the park through an internship scheme that was managed by the industrial park themselves. And we also had a grant where an NGO worked with expertise working with youth in conflict zones and was already delivering literacy and numeracy skills, went into a partnership with an industrial training provider with expertise in specific construction skills from level 1 up to semi-skilled training in specific occupations near a development site in northern Mozambique. So the grants were often targeting specific gaps in learning pathways and creating connections. The strategic connections in the ecosystem made with the qualifications bodies where relevant in Mozambique. So there wasn't a requirement in Mozambique. And that opened the space for some innovative grants driven by enterprises. For example, we worked with a social enterprise, which was a bike factory that wanted to grow a network of micro enterprises of bicycle repair technicians, because they had noticed their bikes, which were being funded through corporate social responsibility and donor projects, and were all over Mozambique, didn't have the life span that they expected because they're not being well maintained, and so they set up a network of micro enterprises linked to the factory and trained bike technicians. The results were very impressive for training and training for employment programs in labour markets that are characterised by very high rates of youth unemployment. So we had 57% of graduates of the Mozambican programme found employment within a year of graduation. And significantly, 60% of those found their job within the first 2 months of graduating. In Mozambique, about 50% of graduates were earning above the minimum wage in their industry. And through regression analysis over the cohorts that we had trained, we were able to attribute about £20 to £40 per month salary premium that could be attributed to the JOBA programme. And in Mozambique, in one of the programmes, which was students from the poorest quintile, experienced a 4-fold increase in income following their internship. In the Eastern Caribbean, we saw similarly high rates of employment success. In the Caribbean, it was a requirement of the grant that trainees achieved a recognised certificate, and 83% of trainees did graduate with a certificate. 54% of those then were employed within 6 months, and 20% transitioned into further educational training. So that was actually very high at 70% moving into a pathway. On average, earnings after training were 170% more than before, with the poorest students experiencing a 6-fold increase in income. And one of the tremendous strengths of this programme was that students with disabilities were employed at the same rate as students youth without disabilities. So equitable employment for youth with disabilities, which is not usually the case in most labour markets. And just as a sort of a cliffhanger before I hand over, in the Caribbean, although many of the students did do the national qualification recognised in their country, we actually saw even higher employment rates with those who had been funded to do an international certificate. So the freedom to work with non-state actors who have the freedom to link up with international certification can be an advantage. We saw 62% employment rates with an international certificate. I think I'll stop there, Dan.
Thanks very much, Rosie, and we'll come back to you for your thoughts on the wider lessons learned and opportunities to connect it to that later. Now we're going to move to Aggie, and now for something entirely different. We're going from skills and TVET to the other end of the scale for early years, early learning, and communities, based on Aggie's work in Uganda. So Aggie, over to you.
Thank you, Dan, and good afternoon, good morning, everyone, wherever you are, from a very warm Sierra Leone. Before I dive into the slide that's on the screen, it might be helpful just to give a bit of context on the environment we were working in and what parental and community engagement looks like in their children's learning in Uganda. So I think when I personally think about communities and parents in Uganda and their role in their children's learning, I often describe them as education sleeping giant. Uganda introduced universal primary education, UPE, in 1997. And this was a major political commitment and a promise during election campaigns by the current president. Like in many contexts, enrollment more than doubled from about 3.8 to about 8 million learners, especially in government schools. So in many ways, UPE was a great achievement for equity, ensuring expansion for access. But of course, like in many contexts, something else was happening that probably can be best described by what Chimamanda Adichie calls the power of a single story or a narrative, and how single stories can affect individual perceptions and actions or even inaction. Oftentimes, the ability to tell the story of education and lots of other stories, to define what stories are told about what role parents and communities should play or should not play, often lies with those in positions of power. From the start, UPE and the narrative around UPE, the story around UPE was that it became framed less around universal education to more around free education. For many rural families, the dominant message they were given was quite simple. Education is free. Your responsibility is simply to send your child to school. And parents, of course, did exactly that. Children arrived in school often without books, without lunch, and in classrooms that were extremely large. That is characteristic of UPE, and schools were not prepared to receive them. Of course, at the same time, the political message that was reinforced was schools should never, under any circumstances, ask parents for support or contributions. What this then happened is that parent-teacher associations became less influential. It weakened the relationship between schools, teachers, and communities, and the connection between families and the learning process became even more distant. In many ways, as I said, education sleeping giant quietly went to sleep. Education's giant quietly went to sleep. At the same time, of course, learning outcomes remained low. 70 to 80% still can't read or write or even complete basic numeracy tasks. Uganda's dropout rates, I think, are the second highest in sub-Saharan Africa. About 65 to 70% of learners drop out. So back to the slide on the screen. So when we began implementing the CECIL program in 2018, CECIL was strengthening education systems for improved learning, CECIL. We were working in 17 districts from the 2 regions with the lowest learning outcomes in Uganda. And our main goal was to contribute to strengthening the foundations of learning in the early grades in primary school. And the next slide, please. So COVID then happened, and as Dan explained, Uganda's schools were closed for 2 years, the longest in the world. And like many programs, we had to think quickly and change our approach. Dan, just skip, sorry, Helen, just do next. Thank you very much. So that is when we introduced community-led learning that we commonly refer to as CLL. This was initially a response to the pandemic to make sure that children in lower primary grades 1 to 3 continue to learn while schools were closed. Small groups of about 25 children met in community spaces for about 4 hours each week, focusing on literacy and numeracy, 48 lessons in each subject, which was 96 lessons in total over a period of 3 months. The classes were led by volunteers from the community using simple scripted lesson plans we developed, supported by family-led learning materials that parents and guardians could use at home. What therefore started as an emergency response continued even when the pandemic ended and when schools reopened 2 years later, as CLL was included in the Ministry of Education school reopening strategy. across the program, we were able to reach roughly 340,000 children. Next slide, please, Helen. Thank you. Initially, we supported this directly. We had the direct support model where we provided printing, the learning materials, facilitated training of the volunteers and the CLL committees, facilitated the sensitization of communities, paid a stipend for the volunteers and the mentor teachers and the committee members who were responsible for providing oversight and delivery of the program and the community. But of course, communities were doing a great deal as well. Parents hosted the classes in their homes, community spaces, including churches, mosques also hosted the classes. Local leaders helped identify and verify the volunteers to ensure safeguarding and being around children. Communities provided simple furniture, hygiene facilities, hand washing. I remember even a particular home where they didn't have a latrine or toilet. The parents came and dug a fresh latrine or toilet for the learners to use as they attending classes where the space had been identified. So they provided the learning spaces. But of course, we were constantly asking the difficult question on sustainability that many of us face in programs like this. The central government, the districts, the communities were asking us the same questions. So we then piloted and tested a hands-off model where we provided the hardware still, similar to the direct model, the books, the memory cards, the blackboards, the chalk, provided an initial training to the local government for them then detailing how they should implement, the selection of volunteers, the placement tests for the learners, payment of the volunteers, and all of that were then left to the local governments and communities. Next slide, please, Helen. So how sustainable is CLL? So Helen, just do next, so that all three, thank you very much. So how sustainable was CLL? We often framed sustainability around the three questions. First, who does it? And of course, the answer to this was encouraging, as I've just explained. Communities had volunteers ready to teach, parents willing to host the learning spaces, local leaders mobilizing support. The second question was, does it matter? And I think for me, what was powerful was not just the scale, it was seeing parents sitting at the back of these small community classes, watching their children read and solve problems. For many of them, it was the first time they had actually seen how their child was learning. Next slide, please, Helen. So, the third question, of course, is the hardest. It's always the hardest. Helen, you can just click, 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 so that everything come again, please. Again. There you go. The third question, of course, was the hardest, and it's always the hardest for very many people. Who pays for all of this? So using the hands-off cohort, as I say, we gave the initial training to the local governments. We then stepped back and acted as a learning partner as different districts and communities explored different approaches and answers to this question. Some districts decided to integrate CLL within the school calendar, and classes were happening during the formal classes, and they included it in the timetable, specific time for CLL as a catch-up approach to learning and lost time. Some communities, others mobilized support from well-wishers in their communities. Some communities agreed to a small financial contribution to support the volunteers, while others contributed in paying the volunteers in kind, either through food and agricultural produce they had harvested. They also offered to weed the volunteers' garden during the planting season. So the most important point here to note was that different communities found solutions within their own context and resources, while we primarily acted as a learning partner, guiding that process, asking the question, helping them document the lessons. I think for us, one of the biggest lessons from this experience is that communities are not simply filling the gaps where state cannot reach, where the state cannot reach, or where state actors cannot reach. They bring something really different. They bring energy, they bring ownership and legitimacy around children's learning. And perhaps the biggest lesson for us, as I mentioned, the ability of parents to be able to sit at the back of these small classes. The biggest lesson was when communities begin to see learning happening again, the sleeping giant slowly starts to reawaken. Learning becomes something that everyone feels responsible for. And Dan talked about system coherence for learning. This is why a system that is coherent for learning matters. The real opportunity and challenge, therefore, for all of us who are working in this space, and the opportunity and the challenge for reawakening this sleeping giant is how do we re-legitimize the purpose of the education system as a whole, so that learning and the evidence of that learning to communities becomes the goal again. Thank you, Dan.
Thanks very much, Aggie. I know you haven't touched on the results, and if people are interested in the results, I think Aggie has a few other slides up her sleeves, but the results were very impressive with this program, as well as the partnership and the package.
I
so
can
we
quickly
touch
touch
on
the results in 30 seconds. That
yeah,
picture
let's
that
do that,
you
because I
see
think it's
on the
important to show that this
screen
is
was one of the communities, because what the classes were for 3 months in a particular community, just 3 months, 48 lessons numeracy, 48 lessons literacy. So that's a community that changed one of the learning centers in whatever name you want to call it, a nursery. So that learning continues and the volunteers continue to teach. In terms of results, after 3 months, we were able to compare children who were not attending CLL classes, but also attending school, and children who were attending CLL classes and using the family-led learning materials. We found that those who were not attending CLL but attending school, around 19 out of 100 improved their literacy level around the 3 months that CLL was running. For those who were attending CLL and using the family-led materials, out of 100 children, we found that 54 had improved their literacy levels. In terms of numeracy, out of 100 children that were not attending CLL, but were attending school, around 40 had improved their numeracy level. And those who were attending CLL, out of 100, around 58 had improved their numeracy level. And just to emphasize again, classes were delivered over 3 months. And of course, because classes were in the community, it was easy to see learner absenteeism as learners are asked by their parents to go and do chores because they're in the community. There was a lot of overcrowding in the classes, even though the guidance was 25. There was overwhelming demand for the classes that sometimes the volunteers became overwhelmed. So there was a lot of overcrowding through attendance of unregistered learners. For weekdays after school lessons, of course, children are tired because it was complementing the school timetable after attending schools the whole day. But of course, for pedagogical factors, the literacy content, one of the things we learned was too ambitious for the 48 lessons. And one of the things, if we had continued this, was to have reduced the number of the lessons and extend the number of lessons and provided a bit more pace. So I think there was a lot of improvements in children's interest in learning and general confidence to learn and express themselves. Of course, we also had the family-led learning materials where all the siblings or guardians were able to support those siblings enrolled on CLL to continue learning. Local leaders championed CLL. And again, they were able to counter that dominant central narrative of education is free to telling the people in their community, you are the sleeping giant, you need to wake up. So I'm happy to go into a bit more once we talk about lessons, opportunities, and challenges. But just to summarize what the results looked like. Thank you, Dan.
Thanks, Aggie. I think that was really important to show it wasn't just a great model on paper, but actually delivered huge value and effectiveness. Okay, on to our third example, our third speaker. I don't know if Daniel's able to connect to do this himself, or Khadija, whether you're going to have to step in, but over to whoever it is for Jess.
Let's try Daniel first. Let's see if he's able to. I can see he's online. Hi, Daniel. Okay, I'll start so we don't lose time. And Daniel, feel free to interrupt at any point if your internet or electricity allow. Okay, well, I'll turn on my camera just so that for the sake of argument. And Helen, we can move to the next slide. So Jess, as Dan mentioned, is one of our biggest programs and has been running in South Sudan for multiple years. This is the second phase that is just completing now. Helen, can we move to the next slide, please? Thanks. Just to give you a picture, South Sudan is a very large country, and the program works across all of the 10 states and the 3 administrative areas. That little green star is where Daniel is sitting right now, hopefully able to join us at a moment in WOW. So the big challenge that we had in running this program right from the beginning was how to enable reach, how to be in all of these places. And so Mott MacDonald, we innovated a model called the state anchor model, where it had different names at different times, but the state anchor model meant that we had a local partner. We have a local partner who is based in and in charge of each of those areas. Sometimes it's the same organization covering 2 different areas or 3 different areas, but it means that we have local presence in every part of the country. There are a lot of people I can see online, Daniel included, who know a lot more about this than me. So apologies. And if anybody wants to add in the chat, some or others I can see online, please feel free to add in the chat or come offline. So the challenge that we were dealing with and the solution that we came up with is because of the breadth of the country, because of the complexity of the country, because of the conflict sensitivity issues, the ongoing various different conflicts that we're dealing with. So if we move to the next slide, Helen, we can see that state anchors are working currently across the entire program. So they work in Output 1, which is the delivery of cash transfers. They work across the behavior change component. They work on the learning component in schools itself, including training of teachers. And the one I'm going to focus on most is the system strengthening one. So next slide, Output 4. The reason I'm going to focus on that is because I think the others, show the strength of a local partner in delivery and in reach. What this 4th one shows is the importance of local partners in capacity building, in strengthening and creating an ecosystem, and most importantly, at that mid-tier at the state level. So the state anchors have been involved in all number of activities, from coordinating activities, supporting registration of learners for cash transfers, training, mentoring, and most crucially, this last one, acting as a bridge between the ministry at the center and activities and ministry officials all the way down. They work very closely with the government systems. So in the next slide, this was a key issue that arose as the program developed over time. So while we were delivering cash transfers and capitation grants in schools, a critical challenge was emerging. At the state and county level, the capacity in the government national level was also needing to be built, but at this level it was very, very low. And developing an ecosystem that was robust at every level, and particularly down to the state level, where where the delivery is at the coal face, this is where state anchors came into their own. And so in JESS 2, state anchors have played a critical role in strengthening systems at that level, in developing mechanisms at that level. So for example, we developed a mechanism at the national level, the Education Transfer Management Committee, which enabled the government to have full oversight and understanding of how the cash transfers were working, whether they were going to girls or going to schools. It was strengthening their capacity to understand the flow of money through the system, which was a critical part of the program. The state anchors were able to replicate and are working to replicate that same system at the state level. So you have that oversight, that transparency, that management, that public finance management, all the way down through the different layers of government. So the state anchors play a really important role of enabling the state education system, government systems to have the ability to manage education in the way that we're also working at the national level to strengthen that. So when we talk about system strengthening and we talk about system coherence, as Dan has shown in the earlier slides, we're looking at coherence horizontally, if you will, across all the different issues that the government needs to cover in terms of delivering quality education or delivering access to education. But the state anchors were able to give us that depth, give us that horizontal depth, so that you have systems that are functioning at the down the levels, down all the way to the school, and not just hovering at the national level. So a really important critical layer and a capacity that is critical. Again, not duplicating, rather creating, strengthening, enhancing government systems. Daniel, I hope I'm getting this right, and if I am wrong, please come in and strengthen any point I'm making here, because this has been a really huge push in JESS 2 and has been a really important part of our work. And in an effort to do this, we've also developed the capacity of the state anchors to understand how funds are managed, understand how to do mentoring and training, understand better how to do safeguarding, do conflict sensitivity analysis. So they themselves, as organizations, have built their capacity to step into these spaces. They've built their technical skills in education, as well as their technical skills in capacity building and supporting the government. I think I have one more slide, Helen. So I think this one is a helpful summary of everything I've been trying to say. The role of the state anchors, the role of JESS, has been to put everything into practice, to walk together with the system so that it delivers, implements, applies its learning, learns and collects data and learns from that data. All is part of that system. And the state anchors have been doing it at the state level while we've been doing it at the national level and across the board. So this is a very good example of a sustained practical partner that is working alongside the government. It wouldn't have been possible without the state anchors to have this happening 10, 13 times across the country in such a huge country. The results, which I haven't got a particular slide on, but the results in JESS speak for themselves. There's huge numbers reached, huge numbers of children passing exams and getting through education and transferring up to secondary education because of this ability to reach and to develop capacity throughout the system. So I hope that's helpful. Apologies, it's not the presentation we'd hope to give you, but hopefully our colleagues from South Sudan will also be able to add in at some point. Back to you, Dan.
Thanks very much, Khadija. Thanks for stepping in. And I think just to reflect on your presentation on that opening slide. On the opening slide, there was a whole bunch of different funders, and I think one of the reasons why so many funders came into this program was because of this state anchor collaboration between state and non-state actors that was proving effective at delivering in places where a lot of other models had not delivered, and that was recognized by that number of different logos on that front slide. I think it wasn't just one funder, it was many who recognized this. Okay, thanks for those great initial presentations to give the the overview of each of those, as I said at the outside, these are very different sectors of education. They're very different types of non-state actors. But I think what we tried to do here was to show that within that diversity, there are some interesting things to learn collectively. And so moving on now to a bit more of our discussion phase, and for others, as questions come into your minds, please pop them in the chat and we can deal with them at the end. I wanted to come back to you, Rosie. So reflecting on your experiences and looking forwards from here, given the context of the sector that now exists, what do you see as the opportunity for non-state actors to play an even more effective role in effective education systems, and what might be some of the challenges that we need to be aware of or try to overcome in order to realize that effectiveness of non-state actors playing their role?
Thank you, Dan. So I think opportunities, very much like Aggie said, actually, are that non-state actors bring something really different and positive to the ecosystem, and they bring in, I think she used the word energy and commitment, and they also reach into areas beyond the state that are vital to effective learning. So they can reach into the labour market, into enterprise, reach into civil society and organisations that play an important role for advocacy and representation. And as Khadijah's noted, the diversity of roles that non-state actors can play, whether it's as a training provider, whether it's an enterprise that offers employment or internships for young people, whether it's building the capacity of other non-state providers, and also that there can be sort of spaces where specialist knowledge and skills can be built that can then be shared more efficiently across a broader range of providers, or to higher levels than the state can maybe support, particularly in, say, areas like ICT or AI, or particular occupational areas or agricultural expertise, where the state often struggles to maintain that level of knowledge and expertise internally. They often being a bit more flexible and adaptable and more responsive, can respond to employers and changes in enterprise, and have the capacity and the partnerships to partner in a sort of a mutuality in ways that the state isn't always easy. Yeah, and in the case of these funds in particular, the institutional autonomy to respond to external funding. I mean, the reason that the state providers could not be included in the programme were the conditionality of the funding and the financial management requirements that went with the funding, and even basic things like having an independent bank account, which can be, so they can be in a conduit for external funding coming into the sector in a targeted way. So I think on the challenges side, I think any challenges for non-state actors to be involved in the TVET ecosystem need to be interrogated, because they're so important in this sector and they play such a vital role. I think that anything that the state does that sort of crowds them out, I think, needs to be questioned. Working with non-state actors means working with a lot of diversity, and that can be a challenge if a funder or if a accreditation body or registration body has sort of one-size-fits-all approach, or insists on the use of national qualifications where they're not relevant and would suppress effective supply. And I think the state can't. Another challenge is the state can't rely on non-state sector to deliver all skills. Some forms are just too expensive to rely on student fees or a single employer to fund. And so there is a need for a public technical and vocational sector, but its investment in TVET, I think, needs to be highly strategic, linked to industrial policies and plans and regional sub-state economies. And yeah, sustainable financing in the contexts we worked in. The FCDO investments were made on the understanding that governments had started policy discussions on levy grant systems, but the evidence base on levy grants in dysfunctional labour markets is patchy. It's not very robust. The external funding needs to be more patient with longer periods of investment. And if it's not intended as sustainable funding, or then we do need evidence of more effective financing for TVET in low resource economies. Yeah, so I think those are the main challenges.
Thanks, Rosie. I feel like that sustainability of funding might be a recurrent challenge that we hear from the others too. But let's see, Aggie, what about you? Great example in Uganda. What wider opportunities do you think there are in the country or in other countries for non-state actors from the kind of parent and community side of things to play a more effective role? And what are some of the barriers you see currently preventing that happening?
Thank you, Dan. I think Rosie preempted what I see the biggest opportunity is that I had highlighted earlier as well. I think building on the experience from Uganda and delivering CLL, I think one of the biggest opportunities for non-state actors, especially communities and parents, I think it lies in something that's quite simple, and that's recognizing that it's not always about money. I think it's very easy when we go to communities to push for that, and for communities that are quite vulnerable and are trying to survive and put food on the table, when money enters the conversation, it makes the discussion very difficult. And I think what community-led learning reminded us is that communities already have assets that are useful for driving their children's learning. They have time, proximity to schools, because schools are based within their communities. They have social networks that they are able to mobilize to weed a volunteer's garden, to provide support in kind so that a volunteer is paid in kind for the work that they are doing to teach their children. You have the local leadership who are based within the communities and have the ears of the people that they lead. But communities also have a deep interest in their children's learning and future. I know that there's always a common narrative that parents, especially in rural areas, are not interested in education. That's actually not true, because, well, to a small extent it might be, but I think the education system has failed so many of these rural parents, as I explained. Their children are going to school day in, day out, and learning nothing or close to nothing. So I think when those assets that the communities already have are mobilized well, they can make a meaningful contribution to learning. They can help re-legitimize education systems' original purpose. That was to actually ensure that children are learning. I think we saw how these assets were mobilized quite early within CLL, where parents hosted classes, local leaders helped identify volunteers, and communities created learning spaces using what they already had. They were able to mobilize and say, we will dig a latrine or a toilet so that our children have access to hygiene facilities. None of this required large financial investments, but it required trust, it required mobilization, It required reframing a narrative of what their role was. It required bringing education so close to them that they can actually see learning happening and sit in the classroom and observe what's actually happening. I think another opportunity for me I would say is helping communities become storytellers of their own children's learning and education. And as I mentioned, very often the narrative about education is shaped far away from the communities themselves about what learning looks like and how it takes place. Governments like in my own country, where the narrative is quite centralized, despite us having a decentralized system of education service delivery, donors themselves, even we implementers, we tend to define what the story of learning looks like. But I think when parents and community leaders begin to see learning happening and begin to talk about it themselves, I think for me, that's something that is even more powerful. I think something then starts to shift. The story becomes local, ownership grows because the stories are not external. I think when it comes to challenges for Uganda particularly, I think the biggest challenge is navigating that dominant political narrative around education and the role of communities and parents. I think the message of free education versus universal education is deeply embedded, and it creates sensitivity around any suggestion of how parents can support schools and become active stakeholders in their children's education. The media is awash with stories of head teachers who have been arrested because the communities have been instructed, if anyone asks you for money, report them, we'll arrest them. It's awash with stories of head teachers who have been arrested because they asked parents for money so they could put a tank so children could have water to drink. Also, they could put a toilet within the school. Also, children could have lunch when they're in school. Of course, I know that there are challenges and that process can be abused as well. But for UPE, every learner is allocated, I think, about $4 a year. That money, as we all know, the challenges of school subsidies sometimes doesn't show up for the whole year, or only half of it is set, and it's based on enrollment. So schools have been left exposed, and any attempt to try and reach out for support is really difficult. So how navigating that very sensitive dominant narrative without being bundled into the back of a police pickup truck, I think is a challenge. I think another challenge is finding a balance between state responsibility and community contribution. As my friend Dan, who is our discussant today, kindly mentioned, if the narrative swings too far one way, for example, government is expected to do everything, then our amazing giant will just say, fine, I'll take a nap then. If it swings too far the other way, parents then feel, well, why are we being asked to do all this? Why are we carrying too much of the burden? So how the challenge of getting that balance right, and how much contribution, especially when it comes to money, because even though I said it's not always about the money, a bit of it is required for schools to survive and buy those things that they need. So how do you carefully navigate that balance where parents might be asked to make modest contribution? What would that look like? And I think the last challenge is communities and parents often need to support to be able to create and claim the space where they can contribute. Because as I say, the power dynamics, even in storytelling, are huge. So because power dynamics in many systems and communities do not always, parents and communities don't feel confident to show up in those spaces. So that's a big challenge. How do we create those spaces? Over.
Thanks very much, Aggie. I think for Daniel and Khadija, I'm going to connect that question about opportunities and challenges to our final question, which is about what is the role of third parties, technical assistance providers like ourselves in helping to bridge the gap, facilitate partnerships between state and non-state actors. So what do you see as the opportunities in South Sudan going forwards, and what future role or how can third parties, technical assistance providers play a role in facilitating those partnerships to maximize those opportunities? I don't know if Daniel can respond to that, or whether Khadija, you might have to step in again.
I don't know whether you can hear me.
Yes,
we can hear you.
Daniel.
Yes.
Great. And feel free to add anything else to any of the other things that have come before.
Yes. Fix what I said. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think, Dan, one of the things which, if it is a lessons learned, is that some of these relationships evolve. And actually, to address the question you are asking, what's the future? What's the role? Because when I look at when we started with this state anchor model and what we were looking to deliver, naturally that relationship evolved from the way there was, of course, fears, talk about challenges. There were some fears at the beginning, but the government feeling like when you are bringing the state anchors, they are replacing them. Down the road, they started appreciating them more. Then over time, we realized they are depending almost exclusively on them. They continue seeing how they played a critical role, especially during COVID, in terms of communication. Because for us, with the state structures have massive challenges there. So there's always heavy reliance on that. So I think one of the challenges then you are meeting from, it evolves from a past time you're looking as a competitor to the time where the state almost feels that now you can even do their work better, and they want to sit back and clap. And how do you ensure then that relationships is sustainable, that each party knows what to be able to play? And maybe before I come there's something else which for instance, I saw that through the work, besides getting the NGOs working with us, the project also had an element that we needed, for example, financial providers to be able to support the payment of capitation grants, the cash transfers, and having a conversation I remember, for example, developing the TPE Compact. One of the things we were saying, how can we bring this private sector to be able also to contribute? And the ministry was still looking back to us and say, I think you've been collaborating with them better. Can you please invite so that we can start having those conversations? So to speak that the role we play as a non-state actor in terms of that bridging that gap, in terms of connecting different people to be able to contribute to education. There's nothing you can sit here and perhaps design and say this is what it will look, but you need to be flexible enough, understanding the demands as you roll down the road, and draw the expertise and the resources of every actor to be able to contribute to that. For example, what Khadija was highlighting on when we started public financial management, it was an example about that development, because at the beginning, when we started the first phase of the program, that was a national body. We started a national body, drawing the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Labor, and of course the Minister of Education, and then the partners. Initially, it was just purely us as case. Over time, we started bringing other education partners to that committee. But then we realized that education is decentralized. You could do all what we do. We could be able to lobby for more funding to go to schools, but are these funds reaching schools? But again, that's the part then the state anchors who are dependent most, that they will be able to chase accountability, give us where the money has been diverted, all of the leakages within the government system. But then we realized we can't do that forever, and we had to make a case and saying, look, we've been having this structure at the national level, education is decentralized. What can we do at the state and the county level? And actually, at the point Dan was making, when we were having that conversation, EU was happy because that's something, PFM is one thing which they resonates with them and said, actually, we would be able to support that initiative. So we started then forming those committees at the state and the county level, so that they would also be able to take these roles non-state actors are doing, because normally someone will come and ask you, what's the sustainability? For how long are you going to be able to do this? We are just doing, yes, we are achieving fantastic results, but we are buying these results. How can we be able to sustain them? And that's why we were trying to come up with those kind of structures which are evolving. For example, if you ask me, if you are someone who's looking at how to intervene now where we are, there's now need to link that relationship from the county to the BIAM, but also to the school level. Because there's need, listening to Aggie, what he was talking about, a sleeping child, there's a need to get something we used to do at the first phase of the program, that the school PTAs to be on top of their game, understand what they're supposed to do. But even as they do that, there's a need for, especially the school head teacher, to be able to provide proper leadership, because from where we sit, that's where we have the weak link. So as you try to fix something, something else comes in. When that something else identifies in, you could then be able to, whether you are looking for resources or connecting different people who are looking at areas to invest or to support, you have identifying these gaps. So we will be able to be used, or whoever comes in, to identify those gaps so that you can there's linkages within the education ecosystem. That relationship will continue to evolve. That relationship, there will be each to play from what I have seen. We've been having this model for over a decade. That relationship has evolved. The government in themselves, the systems have been strengthened, but as they are becoming stronger, there is still a role to play. That one I say because one of the things the ministry speaks, it says, the way you guys have worked with us, you didn't work with us as an NGO. The idea was NGOs look at in a way where they come in and they want to do whatever they want to do forever. They are not interested in building systems. They are not interested in transferring skills. They are all interested to come in here and do their bit, finish, and go. So remember, we've worked with the NGOs, but now the government doesn't see that the NGOs, the state anchors, are working as NGOs because of that mentality of not only thinking of what is needed now, but also thinking about how sustainable it is at the government able to take this role. How do we engage in our implementation? Because implementation we have done with the government, visiting schools with them, doing planning with them. So they have learned better and they have come to appreciate more. But of course, there will still a demand, as I say, because this relationship will continue evolving. Done. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Daniel. Rosie and Aggie, I'm going to hold that last question for you because I think it links to one of the questions in the chat. And I'm going to invite at this point, to make sure we have some time for the questions, I'm going to invite our colleague Emma Sarted in to give some reflections on what she's heard today and also connect to her own experience with working on Girls' Education Challenge with non-state actors. Emma, over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Dan. I'm closely clock watching, and I know I could say an awful lot, but I'm going to be very, very brief because I know there are questions in the chat. Thanks everybody for so much detail and great insights. I think there are some very clear trends about how we have worked with non-state actors over time and how that's changed, and also what it might look like in the future. I mean, Rosie, you started off with that clear link between the work of non-state actors and outcomes. I think that's really, really, it's such a persuasive argument, as if we didn't already need one, about how non-state actors can really drive results and change. And Aggie, you went on to kind of addressing the impact of policies and the politics side of it in Uganda. I think, again, there's a gap there or a space where non-state actors are really able to kind of implement and interpret those policies and what that looks like for the betterment of education outcomes. I think if I think to working on GEC and LIFT and all sorts of programs, but if I think back to kind of the COVID time, I think that was a very interesting time when we think about non-state actors, because they gave us all the opportunity to really see what many of us already knew and thought, that non-state actors are fundamentally important to achieving education outcomes. At that time on GEC, there are 189 downstream partners. We called them downstream partners, but actually during that time, people and organizations were elevated because they were the ones that really were being able to reach out to communities, keep learning going. And post COVID-19, there was a very interesting discussion around formalizing the work of non-state actors in the kind of the architecture in that we all work in. But I think that was more about implementing partners owning the process rather than having more seats at the table, so to speak. And I think that's really interesting because I think at Cambridge, we've progressed from having those sort of downstream partners to kind of co-creators. If I think about how NSAs are looked at on the LIFT programme. I know in the last webinar, Alicia was talking a lot about that, and I can put some materials in the chat afterwards. I think, again, you guys were also talking about thinking carefully through the model on how to have local presence for delivery, but at the same time, strengthening at different levels in that ecosystem. So that's about supporting those non-state actors to grow and develop. We heard that in GES, the same in GEC, all programs. Some of that is about supporting smaller non-state actors to be able to access funds. It's not without challenges, but the outcomes of doing so are multiplied. It's very much worth it. There's that whole sustainability question, which I think we're going to come back to. I think what's interesting about this discussion for me was the importance of non-state actors and the degree of involvement in kind of what and how alongside state/government in relation to systems coherence for learning, as we opened up with Dan. The state doesn't need to be everywhere doing everything, and nor should it, but it does need to be kind of ultimately responsible. I can't think of any country in the world that doesn't have a kind of a highly performing and diverse non-state actor sector that operates to support the ecosystem with the state. And I think it's clear from these presentations that where this balance is right, education systems are more resilient, they're more inclusive, and they're better able to improve learning at scale because they can target the bits which are often either blind spots or missed or cannot be reached. So I think in practice, expecting the state to be present, effective and high quality everywhere all the time isn't realistic or necessary. We've seen examples today where the state simply does not have the reach capacity or flexibility to deliver directly to all learners, and in some cases, isn't best placed to. I think insisting that it can slow progress and leave the most marginalised waiting indefinitely, and we definitely saw that on GEC. And I guess what matters more than that sort of presence is where the role the state plays. A strong state or government doesn't have to do everything itself. Instead, it kind of sets the direction, safeguards equity, ensures quality, and is part of how others contribute within that system. And we've heard examples today where non-state actors are not kind of competitors or stopgaps, but part of a wider education ecosystem that the state kind of can shape over time is kind of the idea. I think, just to sum up, I think from this discussion and my own work on the Girls' Education Challenge in particular, there are 3 areas where the non-state actors are integral and have so much to offer in supporting system coherence. And they support governments in their aim to deliver education outcomes. And without them, education outcomes suffer. So number 1, as we heard, it's about non-state actors enable progress where the state cannot yet operate effectively or where it should. And this relies heavily on relationships, as we've heard, and the intensity of those relationships. And where they're intense, they produce those fantastic results. Number 2, I think non-state actors improve the quality by bringing, perhaps specialist capabilities and space to innovate. We've heard that a lot in these presentations. And again, on GEC, I think where these approaches work, they create concrete examples that governments learn from, want to be involved with, adapt, and then scale. And lastly, I think non-state actors strengthen the wider education ecosystem because they're mobilizing other actors within that. And that is really, really significant. I think engaging parents, communities, employers, external funders in meaningful ways really, really changes those education outcomes. And non-state actors do this so well precisely because they are present, they understand the issues around ownership and power, and have deep relationships that can drive behaviour change. And I think this is really important for kind of thinking about the future. And they know and understand the context which interprets those system changes, like the policies and the guidelines, and they understand how implementation needs to work. And moreover, they drive the results that we've seen today. I guess the question is, and where I'll finish, is how should we continue to work with non-state actors and elevate their expertise, experience, and roles to increase that impact, as they do in so many places, And I think, Daniel, you alluded to a little bit of that in terms of government taking over some of that relationship. Dan, I'll stop there because I know there are questions in the chat and we haven't got long. So
No,
thank you.
that's a good segue to, I think. So in the chat, for those who haven't been following that, Aggie has already been responding, I think, to one question around language of instruction, mother tongue. Was it mother tongue in Uganda, and was that part of its success? And so thanks, Aggie, for responding on that one. And I think, Rosie, there's a specific question maybe you can respond to directly in the chat or afterwards around health and safety assessments in the TVET placements. What I want to, given we've got only about 10 minutes left, what I want to do is try and combine a couple of these questions, which I think link on to what Emma has just ended with, which is about given where we are right now as a sector with external funding, and the fact that some of the traditional bridging roles are going to be less available, and perhaps should be less available. How do we make sure that state and non-state actors are best placed to connect, to be developing the partnerships that we've heard can be so effective, with a more limited or perhaps even no bridging support from the likes of us? Is that the state that we want to get to, or are there some alternatives? So I've merged a couple of questions there. Hopefully it makes sense, and I'll throw that back out to whoever wants to pick it up. Otherwise, I'll pick on one of you. Go for it, Rosie.
Okay, so this probably reflects a bit of my own conscious bias, but I think one of if we're moving away from bridging roles, I mean, there are other functions in systems that remain important, to probably, and just as important. They've always been important, but we could be turning our attention to supporting those. One is such a desperate need for stronger evidence base on what works in dysfunctional labour markets and emerging economies, and providing a platform to the voice of researchers who are building that evidence in fragile economies. And at a state-to-state level, the World Education Forum last year kept hearing there's still this over-reliance on policy learning about skills systems in places that are very different economic contexts, and then importing those models or bits of those models, and making claims about effectiveness and claiming to learn about effectiveness, but actually the evidence is quite patchy. And so for me, that would be one kind of bridge that remains, and we should and needs to be supported and strengthened, which is research into non-state actors, their role, there's the skills ecosystems that work. And I think one of there's so much that has come out of the work that needs to go forward, and that other people can take it forward, particularly researchers in the South. I've got other things I could say as well, but I don't want to take all the time.
Yeah, let's hear from others first. Thanks, Rosie. Aggie or Daniel, what about you? How is that bridging role evolving? Can we get rid of it altogether to make sure that these partnerships flourish going forwards?
I think, as we said, I think Emma did mention it. Different people play different complementary roles. And I think bridges are important, whether real or perceived, like the ones we are talking about in this conversation. I think in many ways, where I see the role of external actors evolving is not by sitting at the center of the education system, but instead, how can we facilitate relationships and strengthen relationships and the coherence of those relationships towards learning, helping governments at the central district schools and communities work together more effectively towards a common goal, and that's about learning. So I think one role that external actors can continue to play is to bridge the gap between the different ways of seeing the system and seeing learning, and trust across those differences. Governments oftentimes look at education through indicators they are accountable for. How many, oh yes, look, we went from 3.8 million to 8 million. They look at things like performance at national examination results, because that's what district budgets are based on, and that's what their performance is based on. Infrastructure targets or enrollment numbers. Communities often see education, I would like to believe, through the daily experiences of their children and how that's changing and that's evolving, and are they really learning? So I think part of our role as external actors is helping translate between those perspectives and asking questions like, whose stories are being told about learning and education? Who is telling these stories and who is benefiting from these stories? I think sometimes the stories we like to sell about our delivery, it's naturally how the aid space is structured. We want to tell stories about reach. We want to tell stories about scale. We want to tell stories about learning outcomes, and not the stories that resonate most with the local systems and with the communities, and how to sustain those approaches. So I think part of bridging the gap and that divide is framing solutions in ways that speak to the priorities and concerns of the system itself. And just lastly, another role is helping create spaces where communities and schools can reconnect. I know that Daniel did mention parent-teacher associations and SMCs. How do we rethink about how we work with them and redesign the support and the relationship they provide to schools? Because this has weakened over time. I think we saw through community-led learning that committees made up of parents and community leaders could help rebuild those ties and create a platform for dialogue and collective action where people were coming together to discuss challenges and support the volunteers and support learning. So I think we can continue to help create and support those spaces while ensuring that the conversations remain grounded in local realities and tell stories in ways that matter to communities. And I think that's one of the greatest strengths about Cambridge Education's work over the years, not only supporting the systems and supporting learning, but helping reconnect the relationships that make those systems work. And this, I promise, is the last thing. And it's an aside. I was having a conversation with two colleagues yesterday, and one of the things that they said, and I was like, I want to be like you when I grow up. Those colleagues are online. I won't say who they were. And I remember one colleague was like, but Aggie, you say that to me as well. And you know what? They were right. I think for me, we cannot talk about Cambridge Education's legacy without talking about its people, both past and present, hi Jake, and how they have facilitated the reconnecting of those systems. So I think for me, at the end of the day, I would tell so many people within Cambridge Education, when I grow up, I want to be like you, because there is no legacy without the people that were working behind the scenes. Over.
Thanks, Aggie. So maybe one of the answers is to get those people in different places to have a similar impact in different ways, perhaps. Daniel, I'm going to pass it over to you, because this is an issue you've been grappling with right now as Jess ends soon, of how do you continue to ensure there's a bridge between state and non-state actors without you being there as of the bridge so much. I'll give the final word on this to you.
Thank you so much. I think the point Aggie was making in terms of the relationships, the challenge we have, for example, in these non-state actors, there has been an understanding that they have to be funded by donors. So one of the gaps we see, which we need to fill, is that actually governments also need people who deliver. Governments need systems that are accountable. We have experienced this, for example, in South Sudan, when the government has been putting money to these non-state actors to deliver those money to schools. One of the trust, for example, the Ministry of Education has been given is because of that work in terms of creating structures that will be able to be depended on to be able to deliver. Meaning that even as we are looking in the shrinkage of donor funding, there is a conversation now to have between the state and non-state, because the danger we face today because of the noises elsewhere, saying that because this aid doesn't work, these non-state actors, we don't need them. The governments themselves know that they are needed. But now we need to evolve that relationship, that there will be partnership, even which are existing at those levels, at these lower levels, to be able to support government, their own funding, and also to even help them to source for other funding. That's something else which I see as an opportunity, where government don't know how to write proposals. So there's a need still of maybe working with those governments, developing relationships, opportunities that are existing there, so that they can also be able to fundraise other resources because the needs are diverse. For all this, I want to agree with Aggie that there is need, because it's a relationships. This is basically between, it cannot happen because talk of legacy, talk of anything, if you don't have the right people who will be able to knock the right doors, to talk to the right people, to talk to the people there who are trusted. And for instance, this is the opportunity we have had, that we have had a relationship, whether it's from the executive, whether it's the parliament, even to some extent that you could be able to help and organize meetings between parliament and executive. For example, to speak about budget allocation. Why is that need? What's the gaps that are existing? Something sometimes which will not just happen on themselves. So non-state actors are needed. The roles continue to evolve, but having clear people know where the direction is going, because you know that one of the challenges you face, you need to demonstrate. We needed to demonstrate that we actually know where we are going. We know what's needed. We are evolving with times. And that evolution right now, where it is how do we then look beyond traditional funders to be able to still appreciate that these non-state actors are needed, and they could be able to be supported with resources locally, domestically, and otherwise. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Daniel. What a great way to close the contributions, and I think all that remains for me now to do is to thank our contributors, Rosie, Khadija, Daniel, Aggie, and Emma. To thank all of you who listened, put comments in the chat, and so on. I thought that was a very interesting discussion. We could have had a whole webinar on each one of those things, and probably several more besides. Just a reminder that there's one more of these in the series of 6 legacy webinars next week on tailoring public finance to results. A bit of a hot potato of always, but particularly now perhaps. So I hope to see some of you there for that one. Otherwise, yeah, thank you, and go well. Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.